Hello and welcome to 8-6. Today we're going to be talking about quadrilaterals. Now we really did study these pretty hard last year. We can remember that quad means four. Lateral means side. So a quadrilateral is just any shape that has four sides. That's the only characteristic it needs to have. And then I just will copy this down into our notes, but I'll talk more about it on the next slide. Today, our goal is that we will be able to classify, identify, and compare quadrilaterals. So let's get started. Now here is that table that I said I was going to show you on this slide. So first, let's talk about parallelograms. So a parallelogram needs to have opposite sides that are parallel and congruent. Now, congruent means exactly the same, so their opposite sides need to be parallel and exactly the same size. And opposite angles are congruent, so this angle is congruent to this angle, and this angle is congruent to this angle. That's good to know. Please get these written down into your notes. So rectangle is a parallelogram, so it follows all the rules of parallelograms, plus it has four right angles. So it has everything a parallelogram has, plus four right angles. Now a rhombus has four congruent sides. That's the main one we have to make sure we get down. Four congruent sides for rhombus, and opposite angles are congruent. Opposite sides are parallel and congruent. Yeah, that was from parallelogram. Okay, now a square has four right angles and four congruent sides. So four congruent sides, four right angles. And a trapezoid has exactly two parallel sides. So that just means that it kind of has one pair of opposite sides that are parallel, whereas all the parallelograms in these guys have two pairs of opposite sides that are parallel. And then it says it may have two right angles. So I kind of wanted to draw this out for you so that you could kind of get a picture of how things all work. But first, let's try to describe these shapes here. So give the most descriptive name for each figure. So last year we talked about how squares can be rectangles, they can be a rhombus, they can be a parallelogram, and they're all quadrilaterals. So we want to give the most specific name for each figure. Now this figure has four congruent sides. So a shape with four congruent sides would be called a rhombus. So do you see how I said what figures it has, or what qualifications, what classifications it has first, and then I wrote down what that shape would be. Please make sure you do that. I don't want you to see that you're just writing down rhombus. I want you to say it's a rhombus because it has four congruent sides. And this is really not a square because it doesn't have four 90-degree angles. Next one has one pair of parallel sides, and that would be a trapezoid. A trapezoid. Okay, and the next one has four 90-degree angles and four congruent sides. So that is a square. And lastly, this one does not even have four sides. It has five sides, so this one is a pentagon. Or if you don't know it, for today, you may write not a quadrilateral. but we are going to work on classifying polygons too. But for today, since we haven't done that this year, but we did do it last year, you may just write not a quadrilateral. Okay, so let's kind of look at how are all these related. So if I think of quadrilateral is the thing that describes everything with four sides. R-I-L-A-T-E-R-A-L. And underneath the quadrilateral then, please make sure you write this down too, we have a parallelogram. Underneath you can write four sides. And parallelogram is two pairs of opposite sides that are parallel. Then underneath our parallelogram, we kind of branch out into two things underneath our parallelogram. We could go one route, which would be the rectangle, and one route, which would be the rhombus. Now, a rectangle has to have four 90-degree angles, and a rhombus has to have four congruent sides. And then both the rectangle and rhombus connect together, back together, to make a square. Because a square has to have four 90-degree angles and four congruent sides. So let's write that down. Four 90-degree angles and four congruent sides. Okay, and then we kind of have our own little off branch over here. And that, so really this should kind of go here, or maybe we'll go bring it over here, or over here, and that would be the trapezoid. That has one pair opposite, it's getting really close, sides parallel. Okay, so we start at quadrilateral. We can break into two things. We can either go to the parallelogram or go off on this side note over here, the trapezoid. Okay, so the trapezoid has to have one pair of opposite sides parallel and has to have four sides. So the parallelogram has to have two pairs of opposite sides that are parallel. So we have one pair, two pair. Then off of the parallelogram, we could either go to the rectangle, that would have four 90-degree angles, or we could go off to the rhombus, that would have four congruent sides. Then we'd go off of the rectangle, if we're getting more specific, and go to the square, because it follows both of the things underneath it. So a square has to follow all the rules of the rhombus, rectangle, parallelogram, quadrilateral. Has to follow all of those rules there. And then the rectangle has to follow all the rules of the parallelogram and quadrilateral. They have to follow all the rules on the way up to quadrilateral. So I think this is a great thing also to get into your notebook. It's just kind of like a quick cheat sheet. This would be something I'd write on my note card so that I can remember it for the test. All right, let's try one more thing here. Okay, so now we're going to get into kind of this stuff. So a rhombus that is a rectangle is also a, so now let's look at the sheet that we just created on the last slide. A rhombus that is a rectangle, so that would go into our rectangle, and then we had rhombus over here. So a rhombus and a rectangle is also a square. So rhombus and rectangle would also be called a square. because it follows both of those rules for rectangle and rhombus. A square can also be called now we can kind of go down the line. So we can go from square to rectangle to rhombus. And it can also be called a parallelogram. Lastly, we could also say it could be called a quadrilateral. But if they only give you 3 spaces, I'd do the rectangle, rhombus, and parallelogram. So anyways, that's all that I have today for you today. We're just studying those quadrilaterals, those four-sided figures. But anyways, thank you for watching, and I will see you tomorrow.